in actual fact, there is a convention against biological and chemical weapons. But you know what? The US hasn't ratified it. So they're not bound by it. And of course they should be bound by it. There's no real basic, biological weapons are inherently indiscriminate. There's absolutely no real reason to use them. And nobody should be developing them. But if the US claims that they're not developing them, they're developing countermeasures against criminals and other evil elements that might get their hands on this.
Well, I mean, I know you don't agree with him, Martin, but we're going to hear Dr. Vernon Coleman, the author of the book, again, a second time tonight, maybe once next week. We had quite a lot of him last week, here talking about the various... I mean, he believes it's evil, what's going on right now. Martin.
The confusion.
Well, what does he believe? The biological warfare labs?
No, he believes that the measures which are being taken for a virus that he believes is now basically burnt out are also evil. The idea that you can't have political meetings, religious meetings, this sort of thing.
Well, it's a bit of a leap from biological warfare labs, but there we go.
The confusion, of course, is deliberate. The virus is known to affect the frail, the sick, and the chronically ill, but under the law, the elderly were kept prisoner, even though they might have been as fit as fiddles, whereas many of the frail, the sick and the chronically ill were all allowed to go out, as long as they didn't have a picnic or go bowling. We're being put under house arrest for no logical reason, at the whim of the government, and kept there until we're allowed out. But when we are allowed out, we must keep our distance, and we must walk carefully and avoid the cracks in the pavement. We must wear masks if we go into a shop or a bank or a restaurant, but not if we go into an office. We should wear masks in our own homes, but only downstairs, because the virus doesn't like heights and won't go upstairs. If we go into a department store, we must wear masks on the ground floor and in the lifts, but not in the restaurant. And if there's a higher floor, we don't have to wear masks there. You can stay in a caravan as long as it's more than 18 feet long, and only 2 people at a time can travel in a car which is under 14 feet long. Swimmers must wear masks unless they're drowning. People must not share a mask unless they've been married for at least 5 years. In stores, the staff do not have to wear masks, but the customers must. But in restaurants, the staff must wear masks, but the customers don't have to. If someone goes into a takeaway wearing a mask, they must take their food outside to eat it. But if they enter not wearing a mask, then they can eat food while sitting at a table. We mustn't talk to friends, sing, or do anything that looks like fun. We can play tennis or cricket with one friend as long as the ball we use is wiped with a disinfectant wipe for 30 seconds every time it is handled. If we are professional sports persons, we can play our sport as long as no one watches us. We can enter a place of worship if it's open, as long as we wear a mask and maintain social distancing. But there will be no services, no public worshipping, and definitely no singing. We can go into a pub as long as we sit quietly and order our drinks by using our mobile phones, sit quietly at our table and give all our personal details to the person at the door. We can't play pool, darts or dominoes or take part in quizzes. There can be no live music, and we must not approach the bar at any time or for any reason. We can leave our table only to visit the loo, and then only after the loo has been thoroughly cleaned and sanitised. We can have our hair cut and our nails polished, but hospital physiotherapy departments are still closed. We can visit a dentist if we can find one which is open, but we can't have our teeth filled, so anything aching or painful must be removed. We can go out into the streets to demonstrate for or against politically acceptable views, but we can't go out into the streets to demonstrate for or against the laws which prevent us going out into the streets and leaving our homes. Social distancing laws and laws about wearing masks can be ignored if we are protesting about issues which have been endorsed by left-wing politicians, but not if we're protesting or campaigning about issues which have been endorsed by right-wing politicians. We can't have picnics with friends or relatives if the picnics are held on a beach, in the park or in our own gardens, but we may eat by ourselves in our own homes, though we may not go shopping to buy food unless we wear masks. We can jog in a park, but we can't sit on a bench to rest if we're tired. We can have sex indoors with a professional sex worker, but if we have sex with a fiancé, we must make sure we do it under a blanket in the garden. Nothing makes any sense anymore. We're constantly being warned that there is worse to come. The coronavirus is about to mutate. When it does, then it will become far more dangerous. A completely new virus is about to leap from pigs or bats or some other mythical creature, and it will kill millions, hundreds or possibly billions. Those who've had the virus do not have permanent immunity, and so regular vaccinations will be essential. Next winter's flu is going to be worse than usual. They've said there's going to be much flooding, and no doubt when the floods go down there'll be massive fires. And all this is our fault, because we put up too many statues to the wrong sort of people. We are paying our government and our civil servants to terrorise us. In the thrall of Satan, they and their acolytes are everywhere. Our world is upside down, and it's impossible to guess what will come next. But meanwhile, you and I must continue to aggravate the traitors and the collaborators. It's a war, and we are the resistance.
Well, that's Dr. Vernon Coleman speaking again this week, Martin. Now, I mean, he's having a bit of fun with us there in that he's going through lots of things, some of which might be and some of which might not be true. But I think it's fair to play that, because the point he's making is that it's really, he's saying essentially that nothing makes sense, that it seems that there's deliberate confusion, the point he starts off with.
Well, in that case, we should try and make sense of it, isn't it? And make sensible criticisms where they're justified, and not mix various things up as he does. I mean, basically, he's an entertainer his point, rather than a political analyst.
His point is not that he is making them up; is that the government is making them up, and that we are being told all sorts of mixed messages by the media and the government.
That's right. Well, this is deliberate. There's an awful lot of confusion out there, as we know.
But is it real confusion, or is it deliberate confusion?
There's a question about whether it's deliberate, but of course, if it's deliberate, there's been a biological weapons attack on China, which the Chinese Communist Party have beaten back.
I'm talking about the information that we're getting.
Not
the actual virus itself.
Well, but the information, it looks to me like the British government are majorly incompetent. That's what any.
So this is not deliberate then. There's just an accident.
No, it's not. It may be deliberate. It may be a biological warfare attack on China by the deep state in the US. Boris Johnson isn't in on it. Boris Johnson don't know much, and he certainly don't know much about that.
The disinformation is also deliberate. Is that what you're saying then?
No, the disinformation.
It's just an accident.
The disinformation in Britain is because we've got a load of chumps in charge who can't make up their mind from one minute to the next.
I would disagree with you, very much disagree with you on that one, because I think it's deliberate. We're being told all sorts.
I don't agree.
All sorts of mixed messages in order to really convince us to disengage and actually to instill fear. That's the key thing.
Well, the biological warfare attack on China was to instill fear in China and elsewhere, but the Chinese got on top of it. And as we go into World War III now, the Chinese military, for example, are free of COVID. The aircraft carriers which were coming their way, they've had to park them in loads of places further away because they've got loads of COVID on their aircraft carriers. And of course the aircraft carriers themselves can be shot down by the missiles that the Chinese have got. Now when this all kicks in, people will realise that COVID-19 was deliberate, and the whole thing is deliberate, and it is about confusion. But it's not about confusion about face masks, Tony.
So the censorship coming into the open, we were hearing about earlier, quite a lot about it actually, but our basic ideas like creation or intelligence design also been censored over the decades. We're going to have a listen now to the author of Tornado in a Junkyard, the guy called James Perloff, and his quote, Tornado in a Junkyard, is something that comes from a British author actually, talking about the idea of humanity and life itself coming out randomly through evolution is about as likely as a tornado in a junkyard. So that's an interesting view, which we haven't really had expressed very well. So let's have a listen now to the question: has the spiritual also been the target over decades of a long psychological warfare operation? We're going to hear now from James Perloff.
We're going to present 4 proofs that it's wrong, and then we're going to take 2 proofs that the evolutionists use and show where they're flawed. And I think the best place to start is at the beginning of life. Oh, you know what, Sean? I want you to put a graphic up on the screen, because I think it's important we give our audience a 1-minute refresher on what the theory of evolution says.
Can do. What
what the theory says is that life began in the ocean billions of years ago when the right chemicals formed our single-celled ancestors by chance. And then these single-celled creatures began to evolve into multicellular creatures, and they became the first sea-going invertebrates. Invertebrates, a creature without a backbone like a jellyfish. Then the invertebrates evolved into fish, and then fish yearned to come ashore, and so their fins started to evolve into legs, and they became the first amphibians, which are creatures, of course, that can go on land or water like a frog. And then amphibians evolved into reptiles, reptiles evolved into mammals, and then eventually within the class of mammals, you had these ape-like creatures who evolved into man. And that's the theory in a nutshell. It might be told a little differently from one school of thought to another, but that's it. And that's basically what your kids are taught in school. So to start at the beginning, the origin of life, and Darwin did talk about that, the origin of species, said that life began in a warm little pond, but after a while they realized that a pond wouldn't last long enough for significant evolution to take place, so they changed it to the ocean. So let's see what's wrong with this. Now, I've got a can here of all-natural cola, and if we look at it, it says cola. It says 12 ounces, which it reminds us, in this case, is 354 mLs. It says Whole Foods on it, and it's got a list of ingredients, the amount of fat and sodium, and it's got a barcode, which is scannable, and it's got a pop top, which works very nicely, and it's got cola inside, very tasty, right? Now, does anybody think that this can and its contents and the printing on the outside could have originated by pure chance? And obviously not. I mean, it's too well designed. So that raises the question of how could a cell come about by chance, because it's astronomically more complex than the can I just showed you. And I want to give you a quote. The quote is this, quote, "A simple one-celled bacterium, or coli, contains DNA information units that are the equivalent of 100 million pages of Encyclopedia Britannica," unquote, and that quote is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, cells have a functional unit called proteins. That's their basic unit. And even in a bacterial cell, there's thousands of different proteins, and not to get technical, but proteins are found out in a smaller building block called amino acids, and there's hundreds in one protein, and they have to be in the right order. And some of your listeners, I'm sure, have heard of Francis Crick. He won the Nobel Prize for co-discovering the structure of DNA. And he calculated what the odds would be of getting a protein by chance, in the ancient ocean. You know what the odds are, according to Francis Crick? The odds are 1 in 10 to the power of 260. And if you want to know how big a number that is, you couldn't fit that many electrons in the known universe. Mathematicians usually say that anything with odds greater than 1 in 10 to the power of 50 is impossible. So it would be impossible to get one protein by chance, let alone the thousands a cell would need. And think about it. A cell would need the ability to ingest nutrients, expel waste. And really think about this one. This first cell formed by chance before it died, in the span of one lifetime, would have had to develop and perfect the process of cellular reproduction, because if it didn't, there never would have been a second cell, and Darwin's evolutionary process would stop right there.
Can you tell people about Tornado in a Junkyard?
Well, that's the title of my first book on Darwinism, and I borrowed the imagery from Sir Fred Hoyle, the noted British astronomer. He was asked what he thought the chances were of higher life forms evolving by Darwinian processes, and he said that the odds would be the same as a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and leaving behind a perfectly assembled Boeing 747. Yeah. And I love that imagery, so I chose it for the title of my book. We're talking about science. Science is based on observations, and there are no observations to support this idea that a cell could come about by chance. I mean, nobody's ever seen chemicals randomly assemble themselves into working functional cellular parts. Okay. But our second of four evidences is genetics. And, of course, genes dictate what our physical makeup is. Now, a zebra can't give birth to a baby kangaroo. Why? Because she hasn't got kangaroo genes. A woman can't even be born with blonde hair unless she's got genes for blonde hair, right? Otherwise, she's got to use a Lady Clairol. Now, Darwin didn't know about genetics. As we were saying, science is advancing. It was not a science in his day, at least when he wrote The Origin of Species. And when Darwinists first heard of genetics, when they learned about it, they first resisted it. And the reason was they realized, we don't have to just explain in our theory how the anatomical features came about by evolution. We now have to explain how the new genes came about, because, if we came from a fish, a fish's gene pool is radically different than a human's gene pool. So where did genes come from? And this originally stumped the Darwinists, but they came up with a solution. And what the solution was, Sean, it was mutations. Random mutations, which are a copying mistake in the genetic code. They occur very rarely, but they do occasionally happen, and they do change genetic information, right?
Cancer's a mutation, too.
Yeah.
There's a definite downside to some mutations, James.
I'll say. They say that mutations are the building block of evolutionary change. So in other words, hundreds of millions of years ago, some fish got a random mutation that gave a little bit of an arm, right? And this was conferred such a great survival advantage that it spread through those fish. And then, lo and behold, another mutation came along which gave it a little bit more of an arm, until finally the fish had, through mutation, developed an arm. Okay, here's the problem with that. Science is advancing, as you said. We now have this book, Not by Chance, Shattering the Modern Theory of Evolution by Dr. Lee Spetner, who is no dweeb. Maybe I didn't hold that up in a way you can really see it. But Dr. Spetner, MIT grad, PhD, taught information science for years at Johns Hopkins University and the Weizmann Institute. And here's what he writes in his book, quote, "In all the reading I've done in life sciences literature, I've never found a mutation that added information. All point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information and not increase it," unquote. So what he's saying here is mutations... I'm sorry.
They're destructive. Mutations can be destructive.
They are almost universally destructive. They always destroy function. They never add it. Right. They always reduce information, never increase it. Now, just again, science is based on observation. So what do we observe mutations do to human beings? They give you sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, Down syndrome, hemophilia, and about 4,000 other genetic diseases. They never improve us, yet they're supposed to be the building blocks of evolutionary improvement, right? And now, I want you to put another graphic up on the screen for our viewers, because evolutionists will object at this point and say that there are such a things as beneficial mutations. And the one I want you to put up is the one called sickle cell anemia. Now, I've been on radio and had an evolutionist call up and say, sickle cell anemia, and this is a common argument, by the way, sickle cell anemia is a wonderful example of how mutations create evolution. Now, why do they say this? What's the benefit of sickle cell anemia? Because it's a disease. Well, the benefit is that people with sickle cell do not get malaria. And so the argument is that mutations have reconstructed the red blood cells so we don't get malaria. Okay, so let's look at the picture. And we see a normal red blood cell, and below that a sickle cell. Now, the sickle cell is deformed. It is misshapen. The function of red blood cells is to transport oxygen. It's lost function. It does not transport oxygen as well as a normal cell. It clogs your arteries. It causes intense pain. And I used to work with sickle cell victims back in the 70s. And back then, before medical advances, it was common for people to die in their 20s from this disease. Nobody hopes that their child will get sickle cell anemia because it prevents malaria. Now, it's true that the parasites that cause malaria don't like to go into these deformed cells, but that's just like you wouldn't want to move into a house that was all dilapidated, It has lost function. It has lost information. You know what, Sean? If I cut off my legs, I won't get athlete's foot. It'll prevent a disease, right? So that's the benefit, right? But it's not evolution. All mutations will delete information and function. They don't add to it. That's Dr. Spetner's point, and that is our proof number 2. We see these organisms, right? We see this microorganisms, invertebrates, fish, to amphibians, to reptiles, to mammals. That's a sequence that Darwin proposed and which is still taught in public schools today. All right. So if we look at these pictures, Sean, there are tens of thousands of species that fit into these categories: germs, invertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. But how many species are there that are intermediate? 0. Not one. Nada. But there should be many. Darwin said the number would be inconceivably great. In fact, I'm going to ask you to put another picture up, which is a microcosm of this picture. It's called Fish to Amphibian. Now, to think about it, for a fish to become a walking land creature, it wouldn't have to just evolve new bones. It would have to evolve new muscles to support those bones and new nerves to control the movements of the limbs. And while it was coming on shore, it would have to evolve a whole new breathing system. Now, according to evolutionists themselves, this happened by chance mutations. So, as you can imagine, in the red arrow area here, the in-between phase, there would have to be millions of creatures living and dying. And as I said, Darwin himself said the number would be inconceivably great. So where are they? Why is it that we have no overlaps? The founder of taxonomy, Carolus Linnaeus, he's the guy who started calling creatures by genus, species. He invented those terms, right? He was against evolution because he saw there were no overlaps. So how did Darwinists explain this? Here's how they explain it. All the intermediate transitional forms became extinct.
Well, that's convenient.
Okay. Well, that's like saying that my dog ate my homework. Yeah. The translation of they all became extinct as we ain't got no proof. It just says there's no proof for a cell coming out by chance. And if you can put on the screen one more time, this is the last time I'll ask for it, that evolution sequence from microorganism to human. This is what Darwinists say. We started out as basically a bacterium, a single-celled creature who evolved into a human. But did you know, Sean, science is based on observation, right? Did you know by actual observation, we've never seen one species of bacteria evolve into another species of bacteria? This is a quote from Alan H. Linton, Professor Emeritus of Bacteriology at the University of Bristol in England. Quote, throughout 150 years of the science of bacteriology, there is no evidence that one species of bacteria has changed into another. Unquote. How do you like them apples? We're supposed to believe bacteria became people, but by actual observation, no species of bacteria has even changed to another species of bacteria. Okay, since there are no transitional or in-between forms in the living world, the evolutionists will say it's in the fossil record, and you had asked about that. Let's just touch on that. In my books, I have quotes from evolutionists themselves that there are no transitional forms between any of these major groups, but we haven't got time for that, so I'm going to give you one coverall quote. And this is from Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History. In fact, he was the director of the British Museum. Quote, the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. As a paleontologist myself, I am much occupied with the philosophical problems of identifying ancestral forms in the fossil record. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument, unquote, Colin Patterson. By the way, you'll find the quotes and citations in my books. Let's take a couple examples because you will see evolution will argue against this, of course, because every once in a while you will see a spectacular headline saying a missing link's been found. Let's take two examples of missing links, okay, that have been discredited. Put the picture up of Piltdown Man.
Right.
Now,
complete fraud.
Here we have the Piltdown Man surrounded by scientists. The guy in the white suit is Sir Arthur Keith, noted anatomist. And looking over his shoulder is Sir Grafton Elliott Smith, and you have these other Darwinists. By the way, the reason they're called Sir is because they were knighted for their work on the Piltdown Man.
They serve the Queen. They serve the Queen.
They're still doing it, right? Still serving the different Queen.
Many people do.
Anyway, what was the Piltdown Man? The Piltdown Man was an alleged ape-man found in a gravel pit not too far from Darwin's home. And it consisted of a jawbone and a skull. And when the find was announced in 1912, you know what the headline was in the New York Times? It was Darwin Theory Proved True. Right. Oh, you can always rely on good old mainstream media, you know.
Hearst, that was probably a Hearst publication. Hearst himself wrote that one.
He would have. I think the New York Times beat him to the punch. He was over on the New York Journal, right? But anyway, okay, so this alleged ape-man, which they said was 500 million years old, was on display at the British Museum for about 40 years before it was discovered to be a fake. What it actually was not 500 million years old. The lower jawbone was a modern orangutan jaw. Somebody had simply filed down the teeth to make them more human-looking and stained it to make it look old. And they put it together in the pit with a human skull, which they also stained to make it look old. And it fooled all these guys at the British Museum, although, who knows, maybe one or two were even involved with the fraud. Who knows? But some people would say, okay, well, that was a clever forgery. You know, anyone could be fooled by a forgery, but no one could be fooled by a real fossil. So let's take an example of how you can be fooled by a real fossil. So I'd like you to put on the screen the image I've called coelacanth fossil. And what we're looking at is the coelacanth was a fish found in Jurassic Rock, the age of the dinosaurs. And for years, evolutionists said it had been extinct for tens of millions of years. And they said it was a transition between fish and amphibians. And if you look at this fossil, it looks like it's walking, right? They said this is a walking fish. Look, it's got little legs there. Here's the problem. In 1938, somebody caught a live coelacanth off the coast of Madagascar. And since then, hundreds more have been caught. And if you could put the image now on the screen of live coelacanth, examination of the coelacanth proved it was 100% fish. No amphibian characteristics. Now, why is it so easy to be fooled by a fossil? Because 99% of the biology of any creature is in its soft anatomy, which you cannot access on a fossil. And that makes it very easy to fill in the other 99%, fill in besides the 1% you can see with your imagination. And that's fossils. You'll see an occasional spectacular one announced, but there should be an inconceivably great number of these fossils if the theory is true. And, of course, we don't see those. All right, the fourth area of evidence that I'd like to address today comes from Dr. Michael Behe, who's a biochemist at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. He's written this book, Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution. And in this book, he talks about something called irreducible complexity. Now, what he means by that is that in the human body and other creatures, there are certain systems that are very complex and that consist of interdependent parts. You take away one or two parts, the whole system won't work. Ergo, they cannot have evolved. Now, that sounds abstract, so let's take a practical example that he gives. If we get a cut and we bleed, the body stops that with a blood clot. Now, blood clot might look simple to the naked eye, but it's actually a very complex process. Sean, if you could put up on the screen what I called blood clotting cascade. It's well over a dozen steps to make a blood clot. And a person with hemophilia, which is a disease caused by mutation, is missing factor 8, which I've circled there. And they're at high risk for bleeding. Now, if you were missing 2 or 3 factors in the blood clotting process, no chance for survival, you'll bleed to death. So here's the question Dr. Behe asked. How could evolution have produced this? Because in the Darwinian model, blood clotting would have evolved over eons as random mutations introduced each step of the process. But that doesn't work. 3 steps won't do you any good. 6 won't do you any good. Or 9. If you've only got 9 steps of the blood clotting process, you'll bleed to death. And if you bleed to death, you can't pass on the incremental stages to the next generation. And so the point that Dr. Behe makes is that this whole system had to be in place from the very beginning, which would indicate an intelligent design. And he goes on, he shows the same thing with human vision. You know, what came first? Was it the retina, the optic nerve? They've all got to be there. Same thing with the immune system. What came first? Antibodies, white blood cells. They all have to be working together. So Dr. B is not a Bible thumper, but his point is that there are systems which evolution cannot explain. That's our fourth and last evidence against evolution.
So that's James Perloff there. He's the author of Tornado in a Junkyard, really putting 4 pretty strong cases, Martin, against the evolution as against intelligent design. What do you make of that? Well,
it was very long. There is, of course, a massive dispute about this. Intelligent design is an I mean, it's interesting that there's various versions of intelligent design. Intelligent design could be that the first amoeba was, created by God, and then everything flows from that. And in actual,
maybe an alien.
Well, it could be. I mean, it's possible that we're.
Who created the alien?
Yeah, well, indeed. So, in other words, these are the philosophical questions. Yeah. So, in other words,
you're a philosopher.
It's quite possible. You can logically believe in God and that God created evolution, and I would argue that that's the mainstream view in the Christian churches today. And I think the idea of intelligent design, people need to read Daniel Dennett and Consciousness Explained, a very good book, and he explains how, in actual fact, in all systems, and this is chaos theory, you start off with very simple rules. And eventually complexity flows automatically out of very simple systems. And he shows how it works in Daisy World, in computers, and it also works in the real world.
So you're saying bacteria can make humans?
Well, in actual fact, nothing was mentioned there about DNA. Now, DNA analysis of modern humans shows that we've got some Neanderthal genes, we've got some Denisovian genes.
Well, there was quite a lot said about genetics, actually.
Well, no, but I mean, there's nothing about DNA, though.
Particularly about, mutation of DNA.
Yes, I know,
DNA.
but
he's saying that all it does is destroy function when you get a mutation.
No, because mutation is basically neutral. The sickle cell anemia has developed. I'm not an expert. I'm not trying to argue with experts, but sickle cell anemia, but basically people in Africa developed immunity to malaria. Because, of course, the people who didn't have immunity to malaria, they died, and they didn't have any kids. And the ones who did have immunity to malaria, they survived. And the sickle cell is part of that. Now, in other words, it's got a two-edged sword to it. Now, the idea that all mutations are remove function rather than create function, ultimately, the theory of evolution is based on the idea, it's based on luck, really. It's just based on luck. And of course, when the asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula, all the dinosaurs were absolutely adapted to their environment and have been adapted for millions of years. Suddenly, the environment changed, and that adaptation means nothing.
Well, it could also be that the human beings killed dinosaurs off because they didn't find them very nice.
There weren't any human beings when dinosaurs were around, Tony.
Well, that's according to one.
Well, that's according to mainstream scientific thinking.
Okay.
Now, of course, one of the problems we've got is when we ask questions about biological warfare.
But mainstream scientific thinking is telling us that the first cell, it would be quite easy for that to evolve into the second cell. But James Perloff's pointing out there, it's a miracle to just create cell number one. And it's almost impossible to imagine that would also enable, in its own DNA, that cell to be able to reproduce at the same time as creating it for the first time. And these are pretty powerful arguments.
Well, no, because in actual fact it could have happened loads and loads of time, and the first cell died every time. Until on the millionth time, or the billionth time, because there's lots and lots of cells, one of them managed it. And patently they did, because otherwise we wouldn't be here at all, would we?
Well, he's saying is that's a very strong argument for intelligent design rather than evolution.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you'll find that in biology departments, intelligent design is regarded as cranky, Tony. Now, can I just come back to the point about biological warfare labs and the stuff we normally cover on the politics?
Because in finance departments, much of what we talk about the global financial system being a total disaster and about to collapse, is also believed to be cranky, and that actually the financial system is self-regulating, and we know it's not.
Let's put it this way, Tony. Just because there are things out there which are being manipulated, yeah? So 9/11 was an inside job. But that doesn't mean it was carried out by aliens, does it?
What about intermediate species? We were just talking about there, no evidence of it at all, and no examples of it either. Nothing in the fossil record.
Well, there's loads of fossil records about human beings. That's what I know quite a lot about. I read a lot of anthropology. We definitely evolved from Lucy's people. We've all got mitochondrial DNA that goes back to East.
So have we got a trail of all the different sorts of humans evolving from apes over the centuries?
It's in our physical DNA. They thought that Neanderthals completely died out. And they found some DNA in Neanderthal teeth in Croatia, and then they tested modern humans, and no, not all Neanderthals died out. Some of us have some Neanderthal
Okay, so you
genes.
think the Darwinian model stands up still?
I'm afraid I do, Tony.
Okay.
Sorry.
Interesting. That's all for this week. You've been listening to not the BCFM politics show with Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers and me, Tony Gosling. Thanks for our guest. That is Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers. You can download our MP3s and you can listen in the car or anywhere you like. You'll find this show's podcast, story links, comment page and our contact details at thisweekoneWord.org.uk. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Have a relaxing and enjoyable weekend. Sunday evenings at 7 or even 6 with Danny Lopsh on BCFM. Our boss Pat Hart at BCFM still, we haven't really heard from him if we're going to be coming back. We do hope we may be back in November. We shall see. Do please join us for the Politics Show live stream, 5 o'clock next Friday. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.